there's a very important spiritual principle that comes from India. It actually goes way back to the Vedas, which are the oldest scriptures of India. And the teaching is, paths are many, truth is one. Paths are many, truth is one. So there are many paths. There are many paths to get to the one, to get to the one truth, the one reality. I have been doing a lot on this channel about A Course in Miracles. I'm going to keep doing that, and I also want to start talking more and more about other traditions as well. And I think that if we really look at some of these other traditions, we will start to see, if we look a little bit deeper, we will see how similar they all are. They're all unique also in their own way. All of them came at a different time, different place. It uses different language, different cultural traditions, different rituals, etc., etc. But if you look a little deeper, you start to see the similarity. But ultimately, I think that the point is that even if the paths are different, they will ultimately lead you to the same one truth. And so today what I wanted to do is I wanted to talk about the Four Noble Truths of Buddha and how it connects to A Course in Miracles, how it connects to yoga, the yoga tradition. And you could say that the Buddha was teaching yoga as well. And there is Buddhist yoga, and there's Hindu yoga, and there's Taoist yoga, and there's different Sikh yoga and Jain yoga, and all these different traditions have their forms of yoga. And yoga itself is not a religion. Yoga itself is more a set of tools and spiritual principles that you can use in your life, and also they can be helpful in your own religious tradition, whatever religious tradition you are in. So that's why you could have Jewish yoga or Muslim yoga, because it can help you to be a better practitioner of whatever religion you were born into or whatever religion you practice. So that said, let's talk about Buddha just for a moment. So Buddha lived about 2,600 years ago. He was born in India, and he was Hindu by birth. And he grew up in a palace, and he was the son of a king and queen. And the story, is this historical? I don't know. There are, by this time, there are, I'm sure, many people that are claiming that Buddha was a myth, that he was not a historical figure. It's hard, going back that far in time, it's hard to determine. And it's even hard for Jesus, who lived closer in time. He was only 2,000 years ago. But there is a movement of people that have made a strong case that possibly Jesus did not actually exist, that he was also a myth. But that's not to say that he's not real, because he's real on some level, but just not as a human being. This is the theory. I'm not saying it's true. And the same thing with the Buddha. You could say that there's a Buddha essence and there's a Christ essence, or a Buddha consciousness and a Christ consciousness, which is a real thing, but that they might not have been a historical person. But maybe they outside of the realm of the physical, they inspired people to write down these scriptures and ease the suffering of humanity, basically, something like that. And Buddhism obviously is considered to be a separate religion from Hinduism, even though Buddha was Hindu by birth. That's a whole separate question. We're not going to go into that right now, but there are some differences, obvious differences between Buddhism and Hinduism. Otherwise, Buddhism would be considered to be a part of Hinduism, but it's now considered to be outside of Hindu, the realm of Hindu orthodoxy. It's unorthodox. It's beyond the pale. So Buddha, apparently his first teaching was what has been called the Four Noble Truths. Whether this was his first teaching or not, whether this is, it's become popularized in the West because anything with a number in it tends to get popular, like the 4 people you meet or the 5 people you meet in heaven, or, think of all the books that have numbers in them, right? They sell more, apparently, if you have a number in your book title. Or if you have, your video says, like this video is going to say the 4 Noble Truths of Buddha, and we'll see, it's probably going to get more views. Or maybe I should title it the 4 things you need to know to become enlightened. But all right, anyway, the 4 Noble Truths. This is very fascinating. And keep in mind also that so many of these ancient religions really came around the same time in history. We're talking about that same time period, 2,000 to 3,000 years ago, but more closer to like 2,500 years ago, around the time of the Buddha. A lot of these traditions cropped up that have now become major world religions, such as Hinduism, Buddhism, Confucianism, Taoism, Sikhism, Jainism, you could say Judaism as well, and later Christianity, and later Islam. But Judaism was part of that, Zoroastrianism. So all these major religions really got started in this time period, which scholars have called the axial age. And so many of these traditions deal with one big subject, which is the problem of suffering. And in theology, it's called theodicy, meaning how can you reconcile the fact that this world seems to be a world of suffering with a loving God, or if you have a concept of God, because in Buddhism there isn't a concept of God per se, but let's say a loving reality. How can you reconcile loving reality with a world which does not seem so loving and seems to be a place of suffering? So, Buddha's first noble truth was dukkha. Dukkha generally gets translated as suffering. You could say pain and suffering, which we say in English a lot, pain and suffering. And that is the first truth, is that, and some people say, what does dukkha mean? It means life is suffering. He didn't say life is suffering, he said dukkha. Well, let's see what he said. One of the original texts says, birth is suffering, aging is suffering, illness is suffering, death is suffering, union with what is displeasing is suffering, separation from what is pleasing is suffering, not to get what one wants is suffering. In brief, the 5 aggregates subject to clinging are suffering. Anyway, everything until you are enlightened, in a sense, is suffering, right? We're in a state of suffering, which you could also say is a state of stress, of worry, of anxiety, of tension, of, you could add in there depression, misery, all the things, that we go through on a daily basis. And then the second noble truth is samudaya. These are Sanskrit words, by the way. There's Sanskrit, which is generally you find in Hinduism, and there's Pali, which you generally find in Buddhism. And the canon of texts that are found in Buddhism are generally called the Pali canon. And Pali is very similar to Sanskrit, but it's different as well. For example, you'll see words like dharma and karma would be in Pali are dhamma and kama. Anyway, so the samudaya is the second noble truth, and it means clinging, craving, attachment, thirst, desire. I'm sorry, taṇhā means, okay, these are two things. The origin, sorry, let me correct that statement. Samudaya and taṇhā they go together. Samudaya means the origin of suffering, right? The cause of suffering is taṇhā, which is craving, desire, clinging, attachment. We get attached to things, and that is why we suffer, right? We get attached to, ultimately we get attached to thoughts, beliefs, concepts, but on a more physical level, we get attached to things, to people, to things going on outside of our minds. But ultimately it becomes, we are attached. We realize that we are attached to certain concepts and certain ideas and certain beliefs that we hold dearly, and we can't let go of them. If we could, then we would be free. So samudaya would be the origin, the arising, the cause of suffering, right? So that's the second noble truth. So the Buddha's saying there's suffering and there's a cause of suffering, and the cause is clinging, attachment, desire. Nirodha is the third noble truth. And nirodha is interesting because we find it also in the Yoga Sutras. Yogas chitta vritti nirodha is the second sutra of the Yoga Sutras, which generally gets translated as the cessation of the fluctuations of the mind, is yoga. So here, nirodha is a cessation. You can cease clinging, attachment, desire, craving, and in ceasing, putting an end to those, you end your suffering, right? So what does it say here? You can let go of the taṇhā, which is the desire, the craving, the thirst. And in that you ease your suffering, and eventually you end suffering completely. And how do you do that though? Right? So now, Buddha has outlined the three major things. He says suffering, there's suffering. Suffering has a cause. The cause can be uprooted. The cause can be dissolved. But how do you do it? So the fourth noble truth is marga, which means the path. Marga means path, and this is also a Sanskrit word. And there are many paths. Again, paths are many, truth is one. The Buddha gave his own path, and it's called the Noble Eightfold Path of the Buddha. And what is the Noble Eightfold Path? I'm going to read you what it is here in a moment. Let me see if I can pull it up here on the screen. Noble Eightfold Path of the Buddha. 8 practices: right view, right resolve, right speech, right conduct, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right samadhi. I can read you the words, if I can find it here, what each word is. Might be helpful too. Yeah, I don't see it here. It's not coming up here too quickly, but the 8th is samadhi, which is also interesting because in the Yoga Sutras, which is attributed to Patanjali was a Hindu sage, or we don't really know who Patanjali was either. Patanjali was, for all we know, he was also a mythological character. But Patanjali, in the second chapter of the Yoga Sutras, Patanjali outlines the 8 limbs of yoga, Ashtanga Yoga. And the 8th limb of Ashtanga Yoga is samadhi. So it's the same in the Buddha's path, and in the Ashtanga path, which is also called Raja Yoga. The 8th and the final rung or step or limb is samadhi, right? And some of these other ones are similar too, right? So we have, let's read this again. Right speech, right conduct, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right samadhi. There's a lot of similarity there between the 8 limbs of yoga. This is the 8 limbs of the Buddha we're talking about, and the 8 limbs of yoga are similar. You start with ethical principles, and the ethical principles, living a righteous life, you could say, the ethical principles then will lead you to the higher steps, which are involve directing your mind inward, inverting your mind, and going into deeper and deeper states of consciousness, wherein you will discover the nature of reality. Now, I want to just compare this with A Course in Miracles, because I've been doing a lot on A Course in Miracles. So how does this connect with A Course in Miracles? Well, Course in Miracles is the same thing, right? It's all about easing suffering for yourself and for others, because when you ease your own suffering, you actually ease other people's suffering as well. And this is also in Buddhism and Hinduism. It's like people say that spiritual work is selfish and like you're wasting your time and it's very selfish, people say. And sometimes we feel that way when we're doing it, and we feel like I can't do my practice because that's a luxury. I need to do stuff to help people. But the great masters will say, like Buddha, this is the most important thing that you could do for yourself and for others, right? So don't minimize it. This, you want to remember that how important this work is. And so you're easing your suffering, and you're eventually going to end your suffering. Ending your suffering means you've attained enlightenment. You've reached the goal of life, and you've understood the nature of reality. You've lost your illusion, all of your illusions, and you are free. You've attained moksha. The word moksha, M-O-K-S-H-A, means liberation or freedom. Freedom from, and I'm bringing in another word, samsara, freedom from the cycle of rebirth, the freedom from the cycle of life, death, rebirth, and suffering, okay? And the Course, in the last chapter of A Course in Miracles, in the text, there's a beautiful passage where it says, I am as God created me. His son can suffer nothing, and I am his son. Right? If you want to say child, you can say, right? I am as God created me. His child can suffer nothing, and I am God's child. I'm using gender neutral words there. But there's a reason why the Course speaks mainly in masculine pronouns, but we'd have to talk about that. But for right now, we can just say it's all about ending suffering, right? The transcendence of suffering, where the realization that suffering is illusory. And it's so very similar, once you really look at the Course in light of Buddhism and Hinduism and these Eastern traditions, especially Buddhism and Hinduism, though, and especially the higher teachings of Buddhism and Hinduism, you see that A Course in Miracles is really getting at the same thing. It's about quieting your mind, going within yourself, quieting your mind, going beyond the thoughts, going beyond the ego mind, transcending the ego mind, and eventually dissolving the ego mind, and resting in your true nature, right? You could say pure awareness, the witness consciousness, the observer that does not judge, right? But just observes with a gentle smile, like the Buddha. Sometimes you see the Buddha with that smile, and sometimes you see the laughing Buddha with the big belly and the laughing, right? But sometimes you see pictures or statues of the Buddha, and the Buddha kind of has that, maybe like the Mona Lisa, has that little smile, like there's a humor in all things, and you have to not forget to laugh. This is something we need to talk about, but maybe not right now. But we'll keep this video to 20 minutes, I think. But I just wanted to bring in the fact that this is a big teaching in Buddhism, right? But it's also very similar to what we find in the yoga tradition And the yoga tradition might have been influenced, Patanjali and the Yoga Sutras might have been influenced by this idea. They might have happened at the same time as well. I don't know if we know for sure. I don't know if scholars have shown one way or another. It seems as if Patanjali was writing the Yoga Sutras after and came up with this as a response, the 8 limbs versus the 8-fold path. But they're very similar. It's not like, if Patanjali wanted to one-up the Buddhists, he would have said the 16-fold path. Or, you guys have 4 noble truths, well, we have 8 noble truths. Or you have got 4, well, we only have 2 because we only need 2. You guys need 4 though. Or something like that. But they're all very similar teachings. And you could say it's unfortunate that these religions have become so divided and separate, and even the religions themselves have splintered into sects, many, many, many sects. SECTS, not SEX. That too, I guess. But we have a lot of other videos we could do on all these subjects. But so that's talking about the 4 noble truths of Buddha and the 8-fold path of the Buddha, comparing it with the 8-limb path of Patanjali and the Yoga Sutras, and the 8 nothing of A Course in Miracles, because I don't think there's any 8s in A Course in Miracles. But A Course in Miracles, I began this by saying paths are many, truth is one. And the way you could put this is all the paths are leading to the freedom from suffering, right? To realize that we do not need to suffer, and if we are suffering, we have the keys within ourselves to ease our suffering and to end our suffering. And the keys are given in these great teachings, right? From the Buddha and from Patanjali and Jesus and all these Zoroaster and all these great masters who brought these teachings to the world. Of course, I think that part of the problem is that these things kind of get distorted over time. And I hope that what I'm doing here is to bring back the essence, or helping to bring back the essence. I don't want to take credit for it. I'm just reporting what I've heard, what I've learned, what I've experienced. Maybe you find it helpful, but really, it all comes down to non-judgment and not making one path better or more right than the other path. Because the reality is that everyone has their path in life, and everyone's path works for them, otherwise they wouldn't be doing it, right? So we just have to respect everyone's path, and ultimately, I think all the paths are going to lead back to love, back to oneness, back to unity, back to wholeness, back to yoga with a capital Y, spirit, God, whatever you want to call it. It's all going to lead to that same place, which we can't even put into words, but we can at least point to it. So thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you again very soon. Namaste.